What if history were not defined by systems, institutions, or economics? What if instead history were defined by great men? That's Thomas Carlyle's Great Man Theory. He was an essayist, historian, and philosopher during the Victorian era. And this was a period where industrialization was taking hold. And for the most part, there was a rise in belief that it was the economics and the rise in technology that more or less shapes history. And so the prevalent theory at the time was that it is history that defines great men. But Carlyle decided to actually flip that and say, no, no, it's actually great men that define history. We'll review 7 tenets for the great man theory. History does not create great men create history. The hero sees reality more clearly than others. Sincerity is the foundation of greatness. Hero worship is natural and necessary. Action matters more than theory. Leadership is a moral responsibility. And greatness requires struggle. So we have our first tenet. History does not create great men create history. And we have 2 passages here from Carlyle. The history of the world is but the biography of great men. And universal history, the history of what man has accomplished in this world, is at bottom the history of the great men who have worked here. So for the most part, what Carlyle is saying is that you can actually get an accurate read on history by reviewing the biographies of great men, and you can actually learn a lot more in that way. These great men in particular, they create their own circumstances. So they are not an afterthought of a predefined institution. No, no. Instead, it is their risk, it is their novelty, it is whatever footprint they're leaving that then defines an institution that is left behind them. Jesus Christ is a wonderful example. Upon his death, Christianity has become the biggest religion in the world. You have Genghis Khan with his many different conquests. Ultimately, he defined his own fate and circumstances, and he changed the world. We have Napoleon Bonaparte, who followed by those same rules as well. I mean, he's been exiled and managed to return. Napoleon essentially created those circumstances. And after his death, there was democracy and really wide scale changes that occurred within France. And finally, we have Jonas Salk, who created the vaccine for polio. I mean, that impact is really just affecting billions of people since the 50s when he went ahead and created that vaccine. The second tenet is the hero sees reality more clearly than others. Carlyle says, a great man, we say, is always as lightning out of heaven. Mozart actually captures that perfectly. He said that the music just comes to him like a flash of lightning from the divine. It's not something that he hears as a sequence, it's just something that he intuitively knows. And he just finds himself writing the music as it's actually happening. So Mozart is tapping into something deeper. It's fair to say that he has this grand vision or foresight, and that's what essentially allowed him to create his masterpieces. Carlyle also says, no sadder proof can be given by a man of his own littleness than disbelief in great men. So these men who leave their footprints, they are bold, they are aware of the impact that they have, and they have this ruthless self-confidence in what they're doing. And so we have Cornelius Vanderbilt, who during the Industrial Revolution, he had a monopoly on the water transit, boat, and shipping industries. And so he was by most estimates, a very, very rich man. But what he did was he saw something that others didn't see. He saw that land was this untapped opportunity for transit. And with the Industrial Revolution, once trains came about, he saw that the railroads and the tracks and the specific routes would be a new monopoly. And so he actually gave up his shipping monopoly in order to put all of his chips into the railroad basket. And it was actually a wonderful risk that he took because it paid out in the end. He ended up becoming the richest man in the world. In fact, 1 in $20 bills that were in circulation when he died in 1877 were tied to him. So he had the foresight to see that in terms of this network, railroad is going to be much bigger than the waterways. Then you have Steve Jobs. His reality is really interesting. For the most part, when biographers have spoken to him, when they have interviewed some of his colleagues, everybody talks about the mind bending distortion of reality. That you may come in with a certain perspective or stance when you would approach Steve Jobs, but by the end of it, you will somehow go towards his belief or his vision, and you would abandon your own original idea, but you would evangelize his new idea. And they'd walk away really just wondering how that happened. And really, ultimately, what it comes down to is that Steve Jobs, the way that he would speak to people is he would speak into existence the confidence behind the vision that he has. So, bringing about new forms of technology, making sure that it's of a certain size, getting rid of keyboards in favor of touchscreens. This is the mind bending distortion of reality that he had. And finally, you have John D. Rockefeller. So, for John D. Rockefeller, at this point in time, he starts off within the oil industry. It comes down to the name that he had for his company, which was Standard Oil. He was trying to create a standard. At the time in which he started, there was a lot of volatility within the market. If somebody found oil, they would drill as much oil as possible and sell it. So it could be $2 a barrel one day, then it could be $10 the next. That volatility made it difficult for people to be able to do business. And so, as part of his acquisition strategy, he really was trying to create a single standard for oil that customers can come to expect. But that foresight, again, is something that was really unique to him and not to anybody else who was within the oil industry. The next tenet is sincerity is the foundation of greatness. Carlyle says, all great souls are loyal to the truth. And the first characteristic of all heroism is its sincerity. And this is a really important point because there really isn't a get rich quick scheme here, right? Heroes are taking the difficult path. They believe really strongly in what it is that they're actually doing. But ultimately, when they speak, they're speaking with sincerity. They wholeheartedly believe in what it is that they're doing. It almost feels like they're tapping into something bigger than themselves. And it's like they're the conduit in which the universe can work through them in order to advance this really diehard belief that they have. And so we have Theodore Roosevelt over here. And Theodore Roosevelt very much was that. He firmly believed in the use of equipping the United States with a really large military, specifically the Navy. He was a firm believer in the Monroe Doctrine and making sure that the U.S. was fully going to be involved within the Western Hemisphere and not allowing any sort of European powers to come into play. I mean, he wholeheartedly believed this to such an extent that he took a lot of political risks in order to advance that cause forward. Even things like pushing forward on the Panama Canal. We also have John Adams. John Adams was considered early on within the Continental Congress as being one of those who had undying belief and sincerity of independence. I mean, he was the most opinionated person there. You had Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin who had their opinions, but they were mostly quiet and flies on the wall, more perceptive of what others were doing and saying, and then afterwards they would convey their opinion. But John Adams was sincere in everything he was saying, and so he was constantly speaking, he was constantly proving his points with such passion that he actually gained the respect of many of the members within the Continental Congress. He was even considered the leader at some point. And finally, you have Martin Luther King Jr., who ultimately has become a martyr for the cause of civil rights. He firmly believed in what it was that he was fighting for, and his I Have a Dream speech is really proof of that. The next tenet is hero worship is natural and necessary. Carlyle says, we all love great men, love, venerate, and bow down submissive before great men. He also says, society is founded upon hero worship. Now, this is a really interesting concept. Ultimately, what he is saying is that the propagation of civilization really takes hold because we have heroes, because there are heroes that we worship, that we aspire to. And I'm going to make two parallels here that I think really proves that point. First off, we have Carl Jung's archetypes, his belief that there are these universal archetypes that act as like a universal language that exists within human beings. It's innate and built within us, such that when we have dreams, our subconscious is able to communicate with us through these uses of archetypes. That's why we're able to actually interpret dreams. So that's one concept. And the second one is going to be Joseph Campbell and his use of myths. Myths played an incredibly important role for defining ethics and morality and just really rallying people around specific causes. I mean, one could even argue that religion to some extent is a form of mythology. Whether it's real or not is entirely up to you. But these two concepts really coalesce towards this idea of a hero. We all need a hero to aspire to. I mean, I know for myself, when I was 6 years old, I was competing with some of my classmates saying that my dad's muscles were bigger. And they would say, no, their dad's muscles were bigger. Clearly, the muscles were not that big, but we saw in them a hero and ultimately we worshiped them. We wanted to be like our fathers. And so I do see this as being an innate thing that society wants to believe in. So, first off, we have George Washington. George Washington was elected as the first president because he symbolized something. I mean, he was the hero who won the Revolutionary War for us. And it was important for that symbolism, this untouchable hero, almost like a god, to take hold as a leader because no one else could really keep all these disparate colonies, these existing Tories and spies that were still loyalists to the cause even after they've earned their independence. It took somebody like Washington, this massive hero, to really set the foundation for the new nation. We also have John von Neumann. So it's very easy to worship somebody in a mythological sense. Von Neumann is incredibly intelligent. He created game theory. He basically created the diagram for the first concept of a computer, at least a general purpose computer. I mean, there's a lot of impact that he had within physics, mathematics. I mean, you can create a whole list of the fields in which he had a broad impact. But it's also very easy to get caught up in some of the mythology. For instance, what he was able to do at 3 years old in terms of his intellect, just how fast he was able to come up with some solutions and answers to some of these really thorny problems that specialists in their fields have. But von Neumann represents this hero, this untouchable mythological being. We also have Albert Einstein as well. And we do the same thing with Einstein as we do with von Neumann, right? So Albert Einstein was more or less creating this new dynamic. It's almost like he was this bad boy of physics. He didn't really go through the traditional PhD route because of his beliefs and his theories and just really how he held himself. And what he did was he was constantly questioning things. In that time within Europe, you couldn't really push back on professors. You couldn't even ask any questions. It was sort of like shut up and just take notes. But he genuinely had a deep interest in physics. And so the questions he asked were just out of curiosity, not in order to push back. But Einstein, working as a patent clerk, then during his Annus Mirabilis of 1905, comes up with 4 groundbreaking papers that takes the world by storm. I mean, at this point, he is definitely a hero. And it's interesting because that hero image of him carried him forward through life. And it actually made things difficult for the quantum physicists because when quantum mechanics came about, it was Einstein who said, God does not play with dice. And so his firm belief that the universe is deterministic and that it is not really reliant upon this inherent randomness, he stood firm. And it was really hard to go against a giant hero like Einstein. And finally, you have somebody like Elon Musk, who is a polymath, a Renaissance man. I mean, he's likely going to be, as of the recording of this video, the first trillionaire that we have. And he has this really big vision, right? It's not just about the individual companies that he's creating. I mean, he wants to get humanity to Mars. He wants to get us out of Earth. He wants to make us sustainable. Everything he is doing is really coalescing towards his single vision that he has. And because he is such a brilliant executor, what we do is we tend to overlook some of his really poor behavior. And that's what happens with heroes, right? We want to maintain them as heroes. We want to keep this big image of them to such an extent that we try to polish off some of these bad characteristics or habits that they have. And so if these men are actually writing history by being a great man, as you could imagine, an important caveat there is making sure that what we remember is the good stuff and not necessarily the bad stuff. The next tenet Action matters more than theory. Carlyle says the end of man is an action and not a thought. And finally, produce. Were it but the pitifulest infinitesimal fraction of a product, produce it. So Carlyle here is really just against academia for the sake of academia. I mean, he's for using new ideas in order to advance things forward, but his belief is that the idea itself, the theory, is not enough. You need action. And a lot of the qualities of these great men are this bias towards action, right? They're not just thinking about it, they're going to take those concepts and try to build or do something within the world. And so we have Thomas Edison, which is a wonderful example of that. I mean, his whole approach to inventing things was just trying every possible permutation of combination of things for an idea that he had. And so I believe he said something to the tune of it's 99% perspiration, 1% inspiration. So this perspiration is something that Carlyle would have really respected because he is constantly doing things and putting himself out there. And you could make the argument that if he were to just sit there and theorize all day, we wouldn't have any of these inventions because ultimately it's a matter of trial and error. I mean, even in Silicon Valley today, there's this idea of move fast and break things, this idea of iterations, of constantly building upon things and iterating and iterating. It's the difference between a waterfall method of creating things versus agile. We also have Franklin Roosevelt, an intense bias towards action. So his first 100 days were, I mean, I don't even think there's any other legislative actions by any president within any part of the world who has been able to just really turn society around and help out as much as he has. His 100 days have really set some legislative foundations that we're still benefiting from today. But that's what it was. Calvin Coolidge, Herbert Hoover, they weren't doing anything. They felt like if the Depression exists, then who are we to go ahead and intervene? And you have Hoovervilles, and you have these really poor situations for farmers, for actually any standard family during that time. But then you have Franklin Roosevelt, who is ultimately a champion for the people. He has this vision. He really believes very firmly in helping people out through different sets of work, different types of relief. So in those 100 days, incredible bias for action. And then he doubles down by essentially getting the United States through World War II. And finally, we have the mathematician Paul Erdős. So Paul Erdős is one of the most prolific mathematicians. He has written, I mean, probably over 1,000 different mathematical papers. And there's even this Erdős number that people speak of. So if you publish a paper, how many degrees of separation is your paper from some work that Paul Erdős had done? So for example, most of his papers were collaboration. So if you collaborated with him, you have a number of 1. And if you didn't collaborate with him, but you collaborated with somebody who did collaborate with Paul Erdős, then you have a number of 2. But he was prolific, and he actually was addicted to caffeine a lot. And his whole idea was that caffeine is just going to be turning into ideas and math for him. He was very much a recluse and a really big oddball, but he believed firmly in advancing mathematics forward because he just genuinely loved it. And his ability to really push forward massive volumes of mathematical papers is impressive. He would definitely qualify as a hero. The next tenet is leadership is a moral responsibility. Carlyle says, find in any country the ablest man that exists there, raise him to the supreme place, and loyally reverence him. He also says the true commander over men is founded on nature itself. So really, he is saying that if you are capable as a leader and you are innately a great man, it is a moral responsibility that you step into your role and you do so with as much intensity and urgency as possible. But also at the same time, it is a moral obligation. So we have here Lucius Cincinnatus. So he was a Roman general. And what he was famous for was after being an incredible general and winning a bunch of wars, he was given the opportunity to possess power. And instead, he chose not to take it. So this is almost like an anti-pattern, but in a unique way, he stepped into his duty when it mattered as a general, but he also had this moral foresight to say, I do not want to be corrupted by power. He just wants to go back to his farm and tend to his crops. So again, really interesting way for him to step into this sense of morality when it comes to being a general, but also the inverse as well when he decided to relinquish his power. You also have Abraham Lincoln as well. Abraham Lincoln was molded by this innate belief that slavery is wrong. And he really wholeheartedly believed this. And he felt that it was his obligation to do something about turning the tides with slavery. For the most part, there was all of these different legislation that, like the Missouri Compromise, which made it very difficult to not advance slavery forward while also not pissing the South off. And he basically said, you know what, he's just going to have the moral obligation of stepping into this role right when it matters. And he is going to get the country through essentially one of its darkest hours and making sure that slavery would be abolished. So he paid for that with his life. But again, this was something that he felt was a moral responsibility. He knew the stakes. He knew that the country would be potentially split in two, and that this would lead to an incredibly bloody civil war where brother would fight brother, father would fight son. And again, he knew the risks, but he also knew that it was his moral obligation. Winston Churchill is interesting because he stepped in as a leader during a crisis. Neville Chamberlain wasn't really the type of leadership that the UK needed at that time. And so Winston Churchill really stepped up. We also have Harriet Tubman. So with Harriet Tubman, it's interesting because she was a slave, but then she managed to escape and earn her freedom. And she could have just enjoyed her freedom, but she knew that she was capable of getting more slaves on the path to freedom. So with Harriet Tubman, it's interesting because it's the capability that really was the moral imperative here, right? If she wasn't capable of using the Underground Railroad to transport slaves and send them on the path to freedom, who knows if she actually would have stepped up to the plate. Maybe she would. She is an incredible woman. But at the same time, it's that capability that really doubles down on why it is a moral obligation for that person to be taking that action. Last tenet is greatness requires struggle. So with Carlyle, he says, adversity is sometimes hard upon a man, but for one man who can stand prosperity, there are 100 that will stand adversity. And he also says, the block of granite, which was an obstacle in the pathway of the weak, becomes a stepping stone in the pathway of the strong. Sort of like what Marcus Aurelius says, where he says the obstacle is the way. So what's interesting here is Carlyle is basically saying that you have to earn that greatness. You know, you can have the seed of being a great man, but in order to really blossom and become this great man, you have to do so through struggle. And this is a really interesting concept. We have Nelson Mandela here, who was in prison for 27 years and persisted to struggle and be tortured and really just withstand the entire abuse that he was experiencing. But once he was out and once he became president, he did not retaliate. After apartheid, he tried his best to be a mediator and just trying to reconcile the two different sides, very similar to what Abraham Lincoln had done with the Civil War for the South, right? He didn't want to punish them. He just wanted to move forward. You also have Soichiro Honda. And what's interesting is he was actually rejected from Toyota. And when he went ahead and started Honda, he had a lot of setbacks. For the most part, this was after World War II, so the economy wasn't great. His factory actually burned down during World War II, but he went ahead and rebuilt again. And at some point later on, his factory burned down again because of a massive earthquake. But still, he persisted, and now today we're driving Honda cars. So it's a real testament to once you're falling down, you got to get back up and persist. And great men know this. We have Friedrich Nietzsche, who really was probably one of the three most influential people in the 19th century. I would argue that you have Sigmund Freud, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Karl Marx. Those are probably the three people whose ideas really set that century forward. And yet he did this through a lot of struggle. He was incredibly lonely. He was constantly sick. And at one point, it's been rumored that after seeing a horse being beaten on the street, he intervened and at that point just turned insane. And I think he spent like the last 10 years of his life insane. But he really had to dig deep through all the difficulties that he had experienced, the losses of love, any sort of betrayals, and really persist in order to produce the works that he has. And you have Srinivasa Ramanujan, who is a mathematician. And he's a really unique scenario because he grew up in poverty in India. He was essentially self taught in mathematics. He would use these old, outdated mathematical textbooks to teach himself mathematics. But he had a really unique gift. He essentially was similar to Mozart, in which he would say it was like a flash of lightning. The insight just came to him. And he would write these mathematical concepts and provide the answer without necessarily showing the process or the proof, because it was something innate within him. And that actually proved to be problematic with his mentor, G.H. Hardy, who was like, you know what? In the West, this is how we do it, right? We create these mathematical proofs. You have to prove it. You have to show your methods. Ramanujan was never wrong, but he didn't necessarily abide by those rules because he was just earnestly trying to get everything out of what was in him and what was provided to him by this divine source. But he died at, I believe, age 32. He was very young, and he died because after moving from India to the UK, he could not handle the weather changes. He wasn't really equipped to handle the intense cold. He was incredibly lonely, and being a vegetarian, there wasn't any vegetarian options that were available. So the combination of these things, being sick and then not having proper nutrition, caused an early death for him. He really did struggle during that entire time while he was in the UK to provide us some of his mathematical brilliance. And he really is somebody who I would say Carlyle would agree is a hero, because he knew that there was a struggle and yet he still persisted. So that's Carlyle's great man theory. Again, great men create history. History does not create great men. And if you want to learn more about history, you shouldn't read history books. You should read biographies of these great men to really understand how they thought, what they did, and through their actions and their thinking, perhaps we could become great too.